Analysis of violence for Peacebuilders. Hello, my name is Bryn Higgs. Welcome back to the Peacebuilding Practitioner. Conflict analysis is the foundation for peacebuilding work. Any responsible conflict intervention must be grounded in up-to-date and locally formed analysis. A good first analysis tool was developed by Johan Galtung. Galtung's triangle can help you see violence more clearly, whether in your local community, national politics, or international conflict. Galtung's triangle helps you to see violence even when it is less obvious and lies below the surface. Peacebuilders need to appreciate these issues in order to be effective. Galtung identified three categories of violence. The first is direct violence, which includes physical and verbal violence. This is the violence we most easily see, often involving a perpetrator and a victim. Violent conflict obviously exhibits extremes of direct violence. We can think of many examples where this is the case. For example, the post-election violence that erupted in Kenya in 2008 between communities of different political allegiance, or the experience of migrants, including children, forced by political systems and economic desperation to take their chances in small inflatable boats, trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe, many drowning in the process. But violence is not limited to these visible elements. As Galtung points out, there is also structural violence, that is, the injustice and inequality built into the structure of a society. It is invisible. It often involves very unequal distribution of power and wealth. Structural violence has clear victims, but often no clear individual perpetrator. Instead, people are harmed or disadvantaged by the way in which the society is organized or structured. It benefits some in society and disadvantages others. Structural violence can be sustained through threats and the use of direct violence. It can also be sustained through misinformation, manipulation, newspapers and media distortion, deception, unjust laws and repression. Efforts to address direct violence without addressing structural violence can often fail. That's because violence is being challenged selectively or incompletely. In the examples I mentioned, structural violence is apparent in various forms. In Kenya, the direct violence between ethnic groups that erupted during the 2008 elections was not an isolated event. Corrupt governmental institutions had been discriminating against some groups while advancing the interests of others for decades. Their behaviour is an example of structural violence. The direct violence that erupted was part of a wider dynamic of structural violence and violent response to it that is understood by Kenyan peacebuilders. Migrants to Europe are fleeing poverty and powerlessness. They are often the victims of structural systems that keep them poor and powerless. International trade terms, weak or undemocratic governments, dictators propped up by powerful states in their own interests, and so on. The structures of local, national and international governance are deeply unjust to the world's poor. In fleeing the structural violence of these arrangements, many encounter the direct violence of traumatic experiences at sea, or even death by drowning. A third type of violence is cultural. Cultural violence, like structural violence, is also usually invisible. It can often arise from a society's cultural, religious, or ideological beliefs. It is used to legitimize direct and structural violence. In a community, certain kinds of structural or direct violence can become acceptable or tolerated, in some cases thought to be normal or unavoidable. In our second example, the violence that people suffer, leading to forced migration, fleeing from poverty and war towards Europe, is extreme. This extreme violence is tolerated because of a cultural belief that severe inequality of wealth and power between those inside and outside Europe is either acceptable or unavoidable. Peacebuilders who do not equip themselves with an understanding of direct, structural and cultural violence are likely to fail. Efforts to address the post-election violence in Kenya that did not understand or made a conscious decision to ignore the structural violence suffered by elements of the population and thus failed to understand the conflict were less likely to be successful in the long term. Likewise, efforts to prevent drowning in the Mediterranean by intercepting inflatable boats and returning migrants to North Africa are not addressing the structural and cultural violence that drives people into the sea. Peacebuilders need to analyse any conflict before they intervene, and Galtung's triangle is a good first step to doing so. Look out for more conflict analysis clips for Peacebuilders soon on the Peacebuilding Practitioner.